Well, there's another decision that the Supreme Court made, I submit, is in the same category as Dred Scott and Buck versus Bell, and that's Windsor, issued by a 5-4 majority, Justice Kennedy writing the decision. And in that decision, he said that the Federal Defense of Marriage Act that affirms, doesn't create, it just simply affirms the natural created order of marriage as the union of man and woman. He said that that law is unconstitutional. He said the 1996 Congress, which was bipartisan, overwhelmingly passed by Democrats and Republicans, signed into law by Democrat President Bill Clinton, that Congress could only have been motivated by hatred, bigotry, and frankly, they're enemies of humanity. How dare he call people who believe in the natural created order of marriage as bigots, haters, and enemies of humanity? That decision is a bigoted decision of 5 justices. It falls in the same category as Buck versus Bell and Dred Scott. It is not consistent with the Constitution. It is contrary to natural law and revealed law, and it has, in my view, no more validity in history than Buck versus Bell or Dred Scott will, and I think history will ultimately deem it to be in the same category as those. As a result of that decision now, some judges around the country are starting to strike down the marriage laws. In Texas and other places around the country, they're starting to strike them down as though they're unconstitutional. I think that the judiciary is running the risk of delegitimizing itself. Remember that courts, contrary to most people's thinking, they do not have the ability to create law like the legislature does. That's the power of the legislature. They don't have the ability to enforce their law. Who enforces the judges' decisions? It's not the courts, it's the executive branch that does it. If the executive branch doesn't cooperate to enforce those laws, then it's no more valuable than the piece of paper it's written upon. The conflict between Justice Taney and Abraham Lincoln on habeas corpus ultimately proved that. Abraham Lincoln won that battle, and Taney acknowledged that, yeah, you won, Mr. President. I think that this whole thing runs the risk of delegitimizing the courts. When the people who have gone to the polls and passed laws that affirm the natural created order of marriage, they didn't create marriage, they didn't define marriage, right. They affirmed the natural creation of marriage. When judges ultimately raise themselves up and say it's unconstitutional, I think they run the risk of delegitimizing themselves and thus the entire judiciary. One example of that is a judge in Richmond, Virginia, was appointed by Barack Obama to the federal bench, issued a decision saying Virginia's marriage laws are unconstitutional. Well, this same judge, in that same opinion, said that we know that the Constitution says that, quote, all men are created equal, close quote. Well, does the Constitution say that, quote, all men are created equal, close quote? No, it doesn't. What does? The Declaration of Independence. This judge and her law clerks have no recognition between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States. That is first-grade material. A federal judge doesn't know the difference. The law clerks that she employs doesn't know the difference because they're not reading the Declaration, they're not reading the Constitution, and now they're trying to tell us what the Constitution says, and they don't know the difference between the Declaration and the Constitution. I'm sorry, but I just can't go on somebody's irrational decision like that and assume that it carries the weight of law.
Well, you know, it is a little mind-boggling to think that they could declare something unconstitutional, and I'm talking about marriage between a man and a woman, that they could declare that unconstitutional when it's the only reason we even exist.
Yeah. And that's why it transcends religion and politics and partisanship, because it is the very foundation of who we are. Without marriage, without that relationship of man and woman, you would not have the future society. And you can't get it any other way. It's always going to be the union of the man and woman. It's not two men, it's not two women that create children. It's men and women joining together in that union. And we have protected marriage because it is the first form of government. It is the nucleus. If we destabilize marriage, we destabilize our government. We have to strengthen marriage rather than destabilize it, because it's the first foundation. It's where we learn to be responsible citizenship, or responsible citizens, is in the home with mom and dad. It's where we learn how to interact and relate to society, where how we learn respect for people's life, for people's property, for their dignity, and for their humanity.
Is this a matter of just parsing words, the act of marriage versus civil union?
Yeah, now that's a good question. Some people have said, well, why don't you just create a civil union and be done with it? We'll have marriage and we'll have civil unions. Well, Vermont tried to do that. Vermont was the very first state in the nation to create a civil union in 2000. Well, now Vermont has same-sex marriage. California created what they called a domestic partnership. Broader than the typical domestic partnership, it was like a civil union. Basically, Vermont and California had two parallel systems. They had the same rights, privileges, benefits, and obligations for same-sex couples as for married couples of opposite sex. The difference was the label. In Vermont, you went with a civil union if you're same-sex. If you're opposite-sex marriage. In California, you went with domestic partnerships of same-sex marriage if you're opposite sex. Well, what the argument ultimately comes up to be is, first of all, you get those passed because they say, well, we just want to be treated equal. We want to be able to have hospital visitation rights. Well, all of that can be done through contract. You don't need marriage to do that. You can have power of attorney, for example. Well, we just want to be able to have in survivorship. Well, you can do that through a will. You don't need marriage for that. So they said, we just want the rights and benefits to be treated equal. So they got parallel systems. And then the argument in Vermont was, well, what's the difference between the two? Why don't you just, the only difference is now the label. One's a civil union, one's a marriage. We feel stigmatized by not having marriage as the name. So California, eventually the litigation there was over the label. Because if you looked at the two systems, they were identical to each other. One was domestic partnerships, one was marriage. And so the argument eventually devolved to, we just want the label. Just give us the name because you're preventing us from having the name marriage. It's the same thing that's happened with the whole sexual orientation. It's the little bite of the apple. It's the camel's nose in the tent. Let's just create a law that's part of our non-discrimination laws that includes sexual orientation because we're kind of wired that way. We're born that way. That was the argument. Therefore, we should be able to use the argument of civil rights. Just like someone is born a certain color, a certain ethnicity, they have that inherent and they can't change it. So the idea was sexual orientation, you're wired that way, notwithstanding the fact that there's no research that shows that you're born that way. It's always to the contrary. It's environmental or it's developmental. It's got a combination of things. But there's no evidence ever that it's DNA wired. And so that's how it started. And they argued, well, I can't help what I'm doing. This is how I am. So put you into the non-discrimination. Eventually, if you start looking at historically what happened was sexual orientation began to add a word called gender identity. And now they sometimes even leave out sexual orientation. It's only gender identity. What's the difference? Gender identity is what you think. It's fluid. It can change from one day to the next. Gender identity is how you think you are from one day to the next. It's not how you're pre-wired, because although the pre-wired argument started as a means to get the rights, that's not what they wanted. They wanted to be able to have a free-for-all, no restrictions on sexual relations or morality, that you ought to be able to float through this spectrum. The only thing you can't float to is back to heterosexuality, but you can always float away from heterosexuality into all these other areas. And so now you have this gender identity. So now you have somebody who if they have gender identity in the non-discrimination language, it's only what they think they are at any given time. You don't know. So now you get to the point, for example, of transsexualism. It's just gender identity. You have...
They must be confused. I know I am.
Well, you get very confused. You have this happening with regards to the use of restrooms. You have this happening in department stores. You have it happening in schools right now that include gender identity. So somebody who's a boy wants to use the girls' restroom, thinks that in their mind they are wanting to be female. Well, then you need to let them use the women's restroom. The next person comes by who is male, doesn't think that they want to be female, but wants to use the women's restroom, you can't stop them either, because you don't know, because it's all subjective in their mind. This entire abolition of gender is the ultimate end goal of the whole same-sex marriage movement, the abolition of gender, that there is no concept of gender. It is the abolition of gender, and it is an attack on the very created order that God created. That is part of our objective reality.
If you enjoyed this clip, please feel free to check out the full version in the link located in the description panel below. Please be sure to subscribe to our channel. You can also connect with us on Facebook and Twitter. As always, help yourself to the diverse array of teachings located on this YouTube channel or on our website at glc.us.com.